Have you ever paused to consider that the very fabric of reality you inhabit, the space you move through, isn't just out there, but might actually be, well, deeply shaped by the mechanics of your own mind?
It's a mind-bending thought, isn't it?
It really is. And today we're taking a deep dive into one of history's most audacious thinkers, Immanuel Kant, and his truly revolutionary ideas about space.
Right. And our mission, really, for this deep dive is to unravel Kant's radical argument
Yeah.
that space is an innate, kind of built-in framework of our minds.
Not something external.
Exactly. Not an external property of the world itself. And then we'll fast forward a bit to the 20th century,
Okay.
where modern science seemed to just flat out contradict his specific claims.
But there's a twist.
There's a twist.
Yeah.
Only to surprisingly and in some ways quite profoundly validate his core philosophical insight. Fascinating stuff.
Okay, I'm hooked. So to navigate this journey, we're drawing from some compelling sources, including excerpts from Kant's legacy, Space, Mind, and Modern Science.
Yeah, some really good material there.
So prepare for a conversation that bridges, 18th century philosophy with cutting-edge neuroscience, and even the latest in artificial intelligence. This is where big ideas meet some truly surprising discoveries.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really get Kant's revolution, though, we first have to step back into the philosophical battleground that existed before him. What was this crisis in philosophy Kant was trying to tackle back in 1781 with his big work, The Critique of Pure Reason?
Well, the 18th century was really defined by this fundamental split, this huge schism.
Yeah.
On one side, you had continental rationalism. Thinkers like Descartes, Leibniz.
The big names.
Yeah, the heavy hitters.
Yeah.
They firmly believed that true knowledge came from pure reason, independent of experience entirely.
Okay. And the other side.
Then, countering them, you had British empiricism. Locke, Hume.
Yeah.
They argued that all knowledge originated from experience. The mind starts as a blank slate, a tabula rasa.
Right, the blank slate idea. So two totally opposing views on how we actually know anything. What was Kant's issue? What was his beef with both camps?
He just found both positions lacking, really. Insufficient. He disagreed with the empiricist's idea that the mind is just passive, just soaking things up.
Like a sponge.
Exactly. He insisted the mind actively contributes something to experience. But he also pushed back hard against the rationalists' ambition.
Which was?
Their goal of achieving a priori knowledge independent of experience, about a mind-independent world. He argued that pursuit led to these irresolvable conflicts he famously called antinomies.
Antinomies sounds complex.
It basically means paradoxes. Situations where pure reason seems to prove two contradictory things equally well. It showed the limits of reason itself,
Okay, so reason ties itself in knots. To navigate this minefield, Kant introduced these two really groundbreaking concepts: transcendental idealism and synthetic a priori knowledge. Let's tackle that second one first. Synthetic a priori knowledge. What exactly is that, and why was it so crucial for him?
Right. So a synthetic a priori judgment. It's a statement that's both universally and necessarily true. That's the a priori part. You know it without needing specific experiences.
Okay, universal truth, like math.
Sort of, yeah. But here's the key. Its predicate, what it says about the subject, isn't just contained within the definition of the subject. That's the synthetic part. It adds new information.
Can you give an example? Like maybe contrast it with something that isn't synthetic.
Sure. Think all bachelors are unmarried. That's a priori true by definition, but it's analytic. Unmarried is just part of what bachelor means.
Okay, got it. Analytic just unpacks the definition.
Exactly. But Kant looked at mathematics and Newtonian physics and saw truths he thought were synthetic and a priori. His classic example often involves geometry, like the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line.
Right. That feels universally true, but straight line isn't strictly in the definition of distance.
Precisely. So Kant's whole project, his transcendental endeavor, was to figure out what are the necessary preconditions within the human mind that make this kind of knowledge possible. How can we know these universal truths that aren't just definitions, but aren't just learned from seeing lots of examples either?
Fascinating. Okay, before we dive deeper into his argument about space specifically, we need to lock down a few more of his core terms. Let's start with a priori and a posteriori knowledge. How do those differ fundamentally?
Right, this is a key distinction. It's epistemological, meaning it's about how we justify our knowledge, not just the content. A priori knowledge, as we said, is knowable independently of any particular experience. Universal, necessary. Like 7 + 5 = 12.
You don't need to count objects every time.
Nope. A posterior knowledge, on the other hand, is based on experience. It's contingent, could be otherwise, and not universally true. Like knowing it's cloudy today.
You have to look outside.
Exactly. And Kant's big move, again, was arguing for that third category, synthetic a priori. Knowledge that's necessary and universal, but also genuinely informative about the structure of our experience.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about his distinction between intuition and concept? How did he see those two working together in our minds, like different mental tools?
Yeah, exactly, like tools or maybe faculties. Kant believed cognition uses two distinct but crucially interdependent faculties. Intuition, the German is Anschauung, is a direct, singular, immediate representation of an object. It's how an object is given to the mind.
So, like seeing this specific coffee cup right now.
Perfect example. That's an intuition. And for humans, our intuition is sensible, meaning it requires our mind to be affected by something external through our senses.
Okay. And concepts.
A concept is different. It's a general, mediated representation. It refers to objects indirectly through shared characteristics. So you have that intuition of this cup, but the concept of cup refers to all cups generally.
Right. Sensibility gives us the raw input, the intuitions.
And our understanding then thinks these intuitions, organizes them, using concepts. You need both. As Kant famously said, thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind.
Wow. Okay. And this distinction is vital because...
Because Kant argues space isn't a concept we learn by comparing spatial things. He argues it's an a priori intuition, a fundamental, non-conceptual framework that our mind already has before any specific spatial experience.
So Kant is really flipping the script here, isn't he? He's saying space isn't something we discover out there, but something our mind uses to organize whatever comes in. That must have completely reframed the old debate about space.
Oh, absolutely.
How did philosophers like Newton and Leibniz see space before Kant jumped in?
Well, before Kant, you basically had two main camps. Sir Isaac Newton championed what's called a substantivalist view,
Meaning?
meaning he thought space was a real, absolute, independent thing. Like a giant invisible container, an empty stage where physical events happen. It exists whether or not there's any matter in it.
And he had an argument for this.
Yeah, it's famous bucket argument. Imagine a bucket of water hanging from a rope. You spin the rope, the bucket spins, but the water initially stays flat. Then the water starts spinning with the bucket, and its surface becomes concave.
Okay.
Later, you stop the bucket, but the water keeps spinning for a bit, still concave. Newton argued that concavity, especially when the water is spinning relative to nothing nearby, like the stationary bucket, proves there's motion relative to absolute space itself.
Huh. Okay, so space is a real thing for Newton. And Leibniz.
Leibniz had a totally different view. He was a relationalist. He argued space wasn't a real entity at all. It was just a system of relations distances, directions between existing objects. No objects, no space.
So space is just how things relate to each other.
Exactly. He used arguments like the principle of sufficient reason. Why would God put the entire universe in this absolute location versus 3 feet to the left if space were absolute? If there's no reason to prefer one absolute spot, the idea of absolute space is incoherent.
Makes sense. And another argument.
The principle of identity of indiscernibles. If you could hypothetically shift the entire universe 3 feet over in absolute space, everything would look and behave exactly the same. Since there's no observable difference, Leibniz argued it couldn't be a genuinely different state of affairs. So absolute space is redundant.
Okay, so Newton's container versus Leibniz's web of relationships. How did Kant's idea space as an a priori intuition deal with this? Did he pick a side?
He didn't just pick a side. He basically said they were asking the wrong question. He proposed a paradigm shift. The whole debate, Newton versus Leibniz, was about space out there. Is it a substance? Is it relations?
Right.
Kant comes along and says, look, the space we can actually experience and know isn't a property of things out there, things in themselves, as he called them. It's an internal subjective framework. It's part of our mental toolkit.
So he shifts the focus from the world to the mind.
Exactly. He sidesteps the ontological question, what space is fundamentally, by focusing on epistemology, how we know space and experience things spatially. He argued the space we know is a condition of our knowing, not a feature of the independent world.
Okay, now let's really dig into the core of Kant's argument. It's laid out in the transcendental aesthetics section of the Critique. He builds his case in two main parts, right?
That's right, the metaphysical exposition and the transcendental exposition.
Let's start with the metaphysical exposition. How did that establish space as a priori? as not coming from experience.
Well, he argued first that space is not an empirical concept derived from outer experiences. Think about it. How do you even recognize sensations as being outside of you or located in different places?
I guess you need some sense of outside or place to begin with.
Precisely. Kant says our very ability to have outer experience presupposes a representation of space. You need the framework before you can place experiences within it. So space isn't learned from experience. It makes outer experience possible in the first place.
Okay, so it's prior to experience. And that leads him to say it's necessary.
Exactly. His second point is that space is a necessary a priori representation.
Yeah.
You can, Kant says, imagine space without any objects in it.
Like an empty room.
Right. But you can never represent to yourself the absence of space.
Ugh.
Try it. Even if you imagine removing everything, you're still left with a spatial void.
Yeah, you can't really imagine no space at all.
So space isn't contingent on objects. It's a necessary condition for any outer perception. It's a fundamental form of all appearances, as he puts it, given prior to all actual perceptions.
Okay, necessary and a priori. But how did he argue it's a pure intuition, not just a concept? That seems like a finer distinction.
It is, and it's crucial for him. He gave a couple of key reasons. First, space isn't a general concept under which many instances fall. We only represent one single all-encompassing space.
Like London isn't a space, it's part of the one space.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All particular spaces are just limitations or parts of this one unique universal space. Concepts, however, like dog or chair, apply to many different individual things. Space is singular.
Okay, singular. What else?
Second, we represent space as an infinite given magnitude. It contains potentially an infinite number of places within it simultaneously. Kant argues that a concept can contain infinite instances under it, but it can't itself be represented as an infinite whole. That kind of infinite singular representation, he thought, had to be an intuition.
So the very nature of how we grasp space as single and infinite points to it being an intuition, not a concept formed by abstraction.
That's his argument in the metaphysical exposition, yes.
Okay, so that establishes space as this necessary, a priori, singular, infinite intuition. What about the second part, the transcendental exposition? How did that connect space to geometry?
Right. This was maybe even more powerful for his time. Here, Kant linked his view of space directly to the science of geometry. Geometry, he claimed, gives us synthetic a priori knowledge. We talked about that earlier.
Right, truths that are necessary and universal, but also informative.
Exactly. Take a geometric proposition like the sum of the angles in a triangle is always 180 degrees, in Euclidean geometry, of course. This is synthetic. The concept 180 degrees isn't just part of the definition of triangle, but it's also a priori. It's true for all triangles without having to measure every single one. You can demonstrate it with pure reasoning, using spatial construction in your mind.
Okay, so how is this possible?
Kant's answer is, this is possible only because geometry is grounded in our a priori intuition of space. This non-conceptual structural framework of our mind is what allows us to mentally construct geometric figures and derive their necessary properties with universal certainty. Our intuition of space has a structure, a Euclidean structure, he assumed, and geometry simply describes that structure.
So the certainty of geometry comes from the fact that it's describing a fundamental structure of our own minds.
That's the core of the transcendental exposition. Geometry isn't describing space out there in the nominal world. It's describing the form of our own spatial sensibility.
And all of this culminates in his big doctrine, transcendental idealism. Let's clarify that again. What does it really mean for our understanding of reality? Does it mean space isn't real?
It's tricky wording and often misunderstood. He concluded space is not a property of things in themselves. The world as it might exist independently of our minds, the nominal world. We can't know that world directly.
Okay.
Instead, space is a subjective condition, a form of our sensibility. It's a necessary universal precondition for all human experience, the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to us.
So it's real for us in our experience?
Exactly. That's his famous claim. Space and time are empirically real, but transcendently ideal.
Empirically real means?
It means they are objective conditions for the world as we experience it. Everyone experiences things spatially. It's a universal feature of our shared phenomenal world.
But transcendentally ideal means?
It means they ultimately originate as features of our own cognitive apparatus, our minds, not as properties of a reality completely independent of us. They are the lenses through which we perceive.
But I'm still wrestling with this a bit. If human intuitions are sensible, meaning they need some external object to, like, trigger them to affect the mind, how can space be a pure intuition that's a priori, seemingly without any empirical content? It still sounds a bit like an intuition of nothingness.
Yeah, that's a really sharp question, and it gets to a subtle but crucial point in Kant. He addresses it by distinguishing between the form and the matter of intuition.
Form and matter.
The matter is the raw empirical sensation, the data that comes from the external object affecting our senses, the colors, sounds, textures, the what.
This stuff Hume talked about?
Sort of, yes, the raw sense data. The form, however, is the pre-existing structure that the mind imposes on that matter, organizing it. Space and time are these pure forms. They provide the where and when.
Ah, okay. So the pure intuition of space isn't an intuition of empty space as an object.
Exactly. It's the mind's innate capacity or structure for representing any potential object as spatial. It's the format, not the data itself.
So it's always applied to some sensory matter.
In actual experience, yes. The pure form allows us to anticipate the spatiality of any possible experience. This is really important because it keeps Kant's idealism from collapsing into something like Bishop Berkeley's radical idealism.
Berkeley, who thought only minds and ideas exist.
Right. Berkeley denied mind-independent objects altogether.
Right.
Kant doesn't do that. He accepts that there are things in themselves affecting us, providing the matter. He just argues we can only know them as they appear to us, filtered through our mind's forms like space and time. We can't know them as they are apart from our knowing them.
Okay. So Kant builds this incredible, intricate philosophical system. Space is this a priori, singular Euclidean intuition, the very form of our outer sense. It seems watertight, solving the crisis of his day. But then science happened.
Yeah, science marched on as it does.
What were the first big scientific challenges to Kant's very specific claims about space?
The first major blow really landed in the 19th century. It came from mathematicians themselves, with the development of non-Euclidean geometries.
Geometries that weren't Euclidean? How is that possible?
Well, thinkers like Gauss, Lobachevsky, Riemann realized you could create perfectly consistent geometric systems by changing one of Euclid's fundamental assumptions, the parallel postulate.
The one about parallel lines never meeting.
Exactly. They developed geometries, like hyperbolic and elliptic geometry, where parallel lines could meet or where multiple parallels could be drawn through a point. And these systems were logically sound, internally consistent.
And why was that a problem for Kant?
Because Kant had essentially baked Euclidean geometry into the structure of the mind. He assumed it wasn't just true descriptions of our spatial intuition, but the only logically possible geometry. The discovery of consistent alternatives showed that Euclidean geometry wasn't a unique a priori necessity. It wasn't the only way space could be structured, logically speaking.
Ouch. So that hits the transcendental exposition pretty hard.
It definitely challenged the idea that geometry's certainty came solely from a fixed, innate Euclidean intuition.
And then the really big one, the ultimate game changer, arrived in 1915, Einstein. General relativity.
Yep. Einstein throws a massive spanner in the works for the specifics of Kant's view.
How did general relativity directly contradict Kant's ideas, not just about geometry, but about space itself?
Well, Kant, remember, saw space as universal, unchanging, absolute, in a sense, a fixed Euclidean grid imposed by the mind, independent of what's in it.
The stage.
The stage. Einstein comes along and says, no, space isn't separate from time. They're interwoven into a single four-dimensional fabric, space-time.
Okay.
And this space-time isn't a fixed passive stage. It's dynamic. It gets curved, warped, stretched by the presence of mass and energy.
So matter tells space-time how to curve.
And space-time tells matter how to move.
Exactly. This completely demolishes Kant's idea of space as an invariant universal form given purely a priori.
So space isn't fixed, it's mutable. It changes based on gravity. Precisely. The geometric properties of space, whether it's Euclidean or non-Euclidean on a large scale, are no longer considered a priori features of the mind. They're empirical features of the universe.
Things we have to measure and discover.
Yes. We can measure the curvature of space-time, for instance, by observing how light bends around massive objects like stars or galaxies. The geometry of the universe isn't something we know just by thinking. It's something physics investigates.
So the discovery that the universe is in fact non-Euclidean on large scales and that space is dynamic, That seems like a pretty decisive refutation of Kant's specific claims about space and geometry.
Of the specific content of his claims, absolutely.
Hmm.
Science showed the actual geometry of physical space wasn't the fixed Euclidean structure Kant assumed was built into our intuition.
Okay, so the science seems to deliver a clear verdict. Kant, you got the specifics wrong. Space isn't Euclidean necessarily, it isn't fixed. But does
Oh.
this mean his entire framework, the whole idea of the mind contributing structure, was just wrong, thrown out?
Not necessarily. And this, for me, is where it gets really interesting. The scientific refutations actually highlight a crucial distinction that arguably Kant himself was wrestling with. The difference between a formal conceptual system and its actual empirical application.
How so?
Well, non-Euclidean geometry showed that Euclidean axioms weren't the only logically possible set. They weren't logically necessary in the way Kant thought.
Okay.
Then, general relativity showed that even if Euclidean geometry was the simplest or only one we could imagine, it didn't necessarily describe physical reality. The actual geometry of the universe turned out to be different and discoverable through observation.
So the mind structure might not perfectly map onto the universe's structure.
Exactly. Or, put another way, the specific geometry of the universe might be a contingent empirical fact, not something determined solely by the a priori structure of the mind. It doesn't automatically mean the mind has no innate spatial framework, just that the framework isn't necessarily the rigid Euclidean one Kant envisioned, or that it doesn't dictate physical reality's geometry.
So the core idea of the mind structuring experience might still hold, even if the specific structure Kant proposed for space was wrong.
Precisely. The form of the argument might survive even if the content needed updating based on scientific discovery.
Right. And this is where the story takes that surprising turn you mentioned. Despite science challenging his specific claims, Kant's fundamental insight that the mind actively structures sensory experience using innate, non-empirical frameworks has found some really striking echoes in modern fields.
It really has. It's quite remarkable.
Let's talk cognitive neuroscience. What has it shown us about innate spatial abilities? Does the brain come preloaded with spatial software, so to speak?
Well, there's compelling evidence pointing that way. For instance, studies have shown sex differences in certain spatial visualization abilities appearing in infants who are only 2 or 3 months old.
That young. Wow.
Yeah, suggesting these abilities are likely, as the researchers put it, innate rather than learned, maybe rooted in hardwired neural circuitry present from very early on. It's hard to argue that's purely learned behavior at that age.
Okay, so some general innate capacity. But are there specifics? Like the brain's own mapping system?
Absolutely. This is where the discovery of place cells and grid cells comes in. It's Nobel Prize-winning stuff.
Tell us about them.
Okay, so place cells, found mainly in the hippocampus, are neurons that fire vigorously when an animal, including humans, is in a specific location in its environment. Like one cell fires when you're near the door, another fires when you're by the window.
Creating a map of familiar places?
Sort of, yeah,
Yeah.
mapping specific locations. But then there are grid cells found in the nearby entorhinal cortex. These are amazing. They fire at multiple locations, and these locations form a remarkably regular, repeating hexagonal grid pattern that covers the entire environment the animal explores.
A hexagonal grid, like tiles on a floor.
Exactly like that. It provides a kind of universal coordinate system, a metrical framework, onto which the place cell information, specific locations, can be mapped. And crucially, this grid structure seems to be present before extensive experience in a new environment. It looks very much like an innate map.
That sounds incredibly Kantian. A pre-existing, structured spatial framework in the brain. A biological analog for his a priori intuition of space.
It's certainly a very tempting and powerful parallel, isn't it?
Yeah.
A concrete neural mechanism that seems to provide a non-empirical, structured spatial representation.
That's genuinely astounding, a hardwired map. But does this grid system only apply to physical space?
Well, this is where it gets even more intriguing. Recent research in the last decade or so has found evidence of similar grid-like coding in the human brain, not just for navigating physical space, but for organizing abstract non-spatial information too.
Like what kind of information?
For example, navigating purely conceptual spaces, like organizing different bird species based on features like wingspan and leg length, or even navigating olfactory space, distinguishing between different smells. The brain seems to use similar grid-like neural activity patterns to map these abstract spaces.
Whoa, so the brain might be using a common, perhaps innate grid-like code to structure both our understanding of the physical world and abstract conceptual relationships.
That's the hypothesis emerging from this research, yes. It suggests this Kantian idea of an a priori structuring principle might be even broader, applying beyond just physical space to how we organize knowledge more generally.
Okay, this is blowing my mind a little. Given these biological parallels, how does this connect to technology? Artificial intelligence, robotics, are they finding they need something like Kant's a priori structures too?
They absolutely are, even if they don't always call it Kantian. In robotics and AI, having some form of a priori knowledge is often a practical necessity for efficiency and, frankly, for functioning at all.
How so? Give us an example.
Okay, think about a mobile robot exploring an unknown building. Sure, it can use its sensors, cameras, LiDAR to build a map as it goes. That's called SLAM, simultaneous localization and mapping.
Right. Learning from experience?
Yes, but that process is slow and computationally expensive. If the robot starts with some a priori knowledge, maybe a basic floor plan, even an inaccurate one, or just general knowledge like walls are usually straight, doorways connect rooms, it can navigate and map much more effectively.
So it needs a starting framework, a set of assumptions.
Exactly. That a priori knowledge, even if imperfect, acts as a necessary framework to guide its exploration and interpret its sensor data. Without any prior structure, the sensory input would just be, well, noise, chaos.
So just like our minds seem to need this innate spatial understanding, a robot needs its own programmed version to make sense of the world.
Precisely. And you see this explicitly in cutting-edge AI, especially with vision language models, VLMs. These models combine sight and language, but they often struggle with really nuanced spatial understanding, complex relationships, different points of view.
Why is that?
Often because the sheer variety of spatial situations isn't fully captured in their massive but still limited training data. So researchers are now creating specialized datasets, like one called RoboSpatial.
What does that do?
It's designed specifically to train these AI models in what are essentially a priori spatial concepts crucial for robotics. Things like understanding different reference frames, egocentric to my left, world-centric north of the building, object-centric behind the chair, and grasping complex spatial prepositions. The key is under the mat, near the door.
So they're deliberately building in the kind of foundational spatial reasoning that Kant thought was innate for us.
Exactly. It shows that for an artificial system to truly reason about space in a flexible, human-like way, you can't just rely on emergent patterns from data alone. You need to endow it with some kind of formal, non-empirical, structured framework. It's a very pragmatic echo of Kant's insight.
So, okay, modern science and tech aren't proving Kant's 18th century specifics right, but they are showing this deep need for innate or pre-programmed structuring frameworks both biologically and artificially. This is fascinating. How have philosophers then responded? Have they reinterpreted Kant to square him with these discoveries rather than just saying, well, he was wrong about Euclidean space?
Oh, definitely. Kant is far too significant a thinker to just dismiss.
Yeah.
Philosophers, particularly in the Neo-Kantian tradition and beyond, have found ways to adapt his core insights. One influential idea is the relativized a priori.
Relativized a priori. What does that mean?
Thinkers like Hans Reichenbach, looking at the shift from Newton to Einstein, argued that while a priori principles are indeed necessary for structuring our knowledge, they are constitutive of the object of knowledge, meaning they define how we can even think about objects.
Okay.
They're not necessarily eternally valid or absolutely immutable. They can change, evolve, be relativized based on major shifts in scientific understanding.
So the need for an a priori framework remains, but the specific content of that framework can change, like swapping out Euclidean geometry for relativistic spacetime geometry as our fundamental scientific framework.
Precisely. The framework we use is a priori, relative to the experiences within that scientific paradigm. But the framework itself isn't timeless. It preserves Kant's core insight about the mind's active role, but gives up the claim that the framework is fixed forever. It makes Kant compatible with scientific revolutions.
That makes a lot of sense. And what about that tricky phenomena-noumena distinction? The world as it appears versus the world as it is in itself. Has interpretation shifted there too?
Yes, that's also been refined. The older, maybe less charitable two-world interpretation saw phenomena and noumena as literally separate realms.
Which sounds a bit spooky.
It does. The more philosophically common and frankly viable interpretation today is the one world or double aspect view. Meaning phenomena and noumena aren't two different worlds, but the same world considered in two different ways. As appears to us under the conditions of our sensibility and understanding phenomena, and as it might be in itself, independent of those conditions, noumena, which remains unknowable as such.
So the a priori forms, like space, are just part of our way of knowing the one world, not some kind of filter creating a separate, illusory reality.
Exactly. It makes Kant's idealism less about creating a mental fiction and more about understanding the necessary conditions and limits of human knowledge of the single reality we inhabit. It helps reconcile his philosophy with the more straightforward scientific realism.
So putting it all together, while the specific scientific claims Kant embedded in his philosophy, the necessity of Euclidean geometry, the static nature of space, were overturned.
Right. Science moved on.
His fundamental insight, the truly revolutionary part, that our minds aren't blank slates but actively contribute innate structures, a priori frameworks to shape experience, that idea seems incredibly resilient.
It really does.
Validated in surprising ways by neuroscience finding grid cells and by AI needing built-in spatial logic.
Immanuel Kant's argument for space as a pure a priori intuition was, without doubt, a landmark, a turning point in philosophy. By shifting the whole question of space away from just the external world and into the internal structure of the human mind, he fundamentally reoriented the entire debate. He didn't just take sides between Newton and Leibniz, he effectively dissolved their specific conflict by changing the terms of engagement.
Yeah, you can clearly see how his specific claims, tying our intuition rigidly to Euclidean geometry in a fixed absolute space, were directly challenged, first by mathematicians with non-Euclidean geometry,
Undermining the necessity claim.
and then decisively by Einstein, showing space-time is dynamic, curved, empirical.
Right. The content was wrong.
But that core insight, the mind actively structures experience through innate frameworks, that seems to have found this incredible new life, didn't it?
It absolutely did. From the evidence for innate spatial abilities in infants to the stunning discovery of place cells and especially grid cells in neuroscience,
The brain's built-in map.
which really does look like a biological substrate for a pre-existing spatial framework. And then seeing the functional necessity of programming similar a priori spatial knowledge into AI and robots for them to navigate and reason effectively.
Yeah.
It suggests Kant's true, lasting legacy isn't in the specific scientific examples he used, which were bound to become outdated, but in the power of his critical method itself.
The method of asking. What are the necessary preconditions for experience?
Exactly. That model of inquiry, searching for the mind's contribution, the structures that make knowledge possible, continues to be incredibly fruitful, applied now in contexts like cognitive science and AI that Kant couldn't have dreamed of.
And that relativized a priori idea captures it perfectly, doesn't it? The principles might not be eternally fixed like Kant thought.
Right, they could evolve with science.
But the fundamental need for both human and even artificial minds to possess some kind of structured, non-empirical framework to make sense of the flood of data from the world. That seems like a universal and enduring truth.
Beautifully put. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, as you go about your day experiencing the world,
Yeah.
what other innate frameworks, perhaps much more subtle than space, might your mind be using right now to shape your reality? Frameworks that science maybe hasn't even begun to uncover and redefine yet.
That is definitely something to chew on. A little unsettling, maybe. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Kant, space, and these surprising echoes in modern science.
My pleasure. It's fascinating territory.
Until next time.